to Russia because protests are taking place across the country in support of the jailed Kremlin critic Alexei Navalny. As we've discussed many times, he's 22 days into a hunger strike and his doctors now fear that he's close to death. Well, we know that there are some protests that have been happening in the centre of Moscow, that some streets in the city centre have been closed off. One monitoring group is saying that across Russia, 300 people have already been detained. And bear in mind, all of this is coinciding with President Putin's annual State of the Nation address. We also know that in the last 24 hours leading up to these rallies, police have rounded up Navalny supporters in more than 20 cities. Also in St. Petersburg, Navalny's office was searched, and in Moscow, 2 of his aides, who are already under house arrest, were detained. This is one of them.
I was detained, literally for the thought of going to a pro-Navalny rally. For the very thought. They're not letting me out of the minibus now, and I think I will be kept until the evening. But you know perfectly well what you have to do. I think there are many people who are not afraid. And even being in a minibus near the Tverskaya police station, I want to demand freedom for Navalny. Navalny must be alive, healthy and free, and it is our duty to fight for it.
And if that was happening in Moscow, next we move to Russia's Far East. This pro-Navalny rally took place in the city of Vladivostok. Protesters are holding up signs which read, "Putin is a thief." Further east, 8 people were arrested in another protest in the city of Magadan. Then we have this picture from Western Russia. As you can see, another heavy police presence. And in the past few minutes, this picture has come into the BBC newsroom. This is the wife of Alexei Navalny, Julia. She's joined the protest in Moscow in support of her husband. Moscow police say 6,000 people are attending. Well, let's have a look at the live pictures coming in from Moscow at the moment as this protest continues. We're in the middle of the evening, and as you can see, there are police out in force, but there are also protesters turning out in numbers, although it's difficult to assess from those pictures precisely how many people have turned out. Let's get some help on that. The BBC's correspondent in Moscow is Sarah Rainsford. Sarah, thanks for joining us. What more can you tell us about what's happening in the city this evening?
Well, I'm here on Tverskaya Street, which is right in the centre of Moscow, of course, leading down to the Kremlin at the end here. And Manege Square down at the end is where Alexei Navalny's team had called on people to gather for this protest. But that whole square was blocked off. There were barricades up, barriers up from the early morning, because it's also where President Putin held his State of the Nation address today. So the crowds instead have been on the street here on Tverskaya Street. They've also been dispersed around some key spots in the centre of Moscow, but they found it difficult to gather in one place. Now, one thing I would say, you talked about a heavy police presence, you talked about lots of arrests. I would say that there's a much smaller and much lower key police presence here today than we saw back in January when there were those protests after Mr. Navalny was arrested. There's also far fewer protesters, it has to be said. The police are saying 6,000, perhaps more than that. It's hard to tell because they keep moving around. They have been gathering in a point just behind us here earlier this evening. They were shouting, chanting for a doctor to be allowed through to Alexei Navalny. Other people chanting for him to be freed, and others chanting against Vladimir Putin. So the passions here obviously running high, but in terms of a mass protest, well, it's nothing like the size of the protest that we saw back in January.
Sarah, stay with us, please. You mentioned President Putin's annual State of the Nation address. It lasted 90 minutes, was largely focused on Russia's internal affairs. There was no specific mention of Alexei Navalny or of Russia's troop build-up on the Ukraine border. There were, though, several messages for the West.
I just have to say, we will have patience, responsibility, professionalism, self-confidence, self-righteousness and common sense when making any decision. But I hope that no one will think of crossing the so-called red line regarding Russia.
Well, President Putin also accused the West of blaming Russia for its own problems. At one point, he referred to the Jungle Book, likening Russia to the tiger, Shere Khan, being hounded by jackals. And he said this.
Unfriendly actions against Russia do not stop. In some countries, a nasty custom has been introduced to pick on Russia for any reason, and most often for no reason at all. It's some kind of sport.
We
We really don't want to burn bridges, but if someone perceives our good intention as indifference or weakness and intends to burn or even blow up these bridges, then they should know that Russia's response will be asymmetrical, quick and tough.
So lots of pointed messages for the West, and Alexei Navalny is one of the many causes of tension between Russia and the West, and that point has been building since he was poisoned with the nerve agent Novichok last August. The Russian state's widely suspected of doing this, though it denies this. Well, Mr. Navalny then spent 5 months recovering in Germany and was then arrested when he arrived back in Russia in January. Then, this is in a Moscow court in February, he was sent to prison for breaking the terms of a parole order connected to a previous conviction. He'd broken those terms by going to Germany after being poisoned. Well, Alexei Navalny was then sent here, a notorious prison in Pokrov, and while there, he's been complaining of acute back pain and leg numbness after alleging he wasn't receiving adequate health care. He then went on a hunger strike and is now, we believe, seriously ill. On Monday, he was moved to a medical facility for prisoners in the town of Vladimir. That's about 180 kilometres out of Moscow. The authorities say Mr. Navalny's condition is satisfactory and that he's given his consent that vitamins can be subscribed to him. His doctors and his supporters don't agree with that assessment. Prominent Russian democracy campaigner Garry Kasparov also has his suspicions.
I'm gravely concerned about not just about his health, but about his life. And I want to remind President Biden and other foreign leaders that it's better to defend dissidents than to mourn martyrs or even to avenge them. And we understand that the West cannot save Navalny, but it can seal his fate by simply ignoring him. Putin's threat to take action against provocation on Russian interest are not founded because nobody is attacking Russia. Russia annexed Crimea. Russia is occupying part of eastern Ukraine. Russia continues campaign of hacking, interfering with elections, and global assassination campaign. Probably I should say not Russia, but Putin, because Putin is a dictator for life. I wouldn't even call him his president because he has no legitimacy. It's a dictator who relies on brute force inside Russia. You could see all what's happening today across our country, from Far East to European part of Russia, with hundreds of activists being arrested simply for protesting against brutal oppression.
Well, in the past few hours, UN human rights experts have called on Russia to medically evaluate Mr. Navalny abroad. Now, if we bring Sarah Rainsford back in live with us from Moscow. Sarah, can you help me assess the amount of political pressure that's being exerted on Vladimir Putin because of Alexei Navalny's hunger strike?
Well, I think it's considerable. We've seen a number of world leaders from the US to Europe calling and speaking to Mr. Putin and calling on him to make sure that Alexei Navalny doesn't die, essentially. That was what they've been saying. There will be serious consequences, is what the United States said, if Mr. Navalny was allowed to die. So he is under a degree of pressure, and those calls keep on coming. But it's interesting that in the past week or so, the Kremlin spokesman, who we speak to on phone calls every day, his tone has been very, very dismissive. They've basically been saying in the Kremlin, we don't monitor the health of individual prisoners. It's nothing to do with us. And then at the last call, he basically said, we're not going to talk about this anymore, this convict, he says. And he also, the Kremlin spokesman, said, this is not a matter for international leaders to be bothering themselves with. Basically, he said all these calls over Alexei Navalny's health were unacceptable. So it's quite clear, I think, that the Kremlin does not want to give in to pressure from abroad to treat Alexei Navalny any differently than he's being treated at the moment.